Pandemic, ASEAN further strengthened its members' cooperation, which includes the establishment of a COVID-19 response fund. But the struggle is far from over. While countries are now better equipped to manage COVID-19, we are still facing the economic impact of the pandemic with the daunting threat of high inflation and recession. In times like these, regional cooperation becomes more important than ever. ASEAN countries need to stand together to rebuild from the pandemic. With the 2023 ASEAN chairmanship, Indonesia is ready to lead the region in strengthening cooperation in various fields. In the finance track, 3 priority economic deliverables are established: recovery, rebuilding, digital economy, and sustainability. Together, ASEAN countries and invitees will hold discussions to make sure that the deliverables are achieved. Because if there's anything that the pandemic has taught us, it is the importance of working together to recover, to grow. ASEAN Matters, epicentrum of growth. "2023 is the year of recovery, the year of growth, and the year of ASEAN." Not only to overcome the effect of the pandemic, ASEAN countries have the potential to thrive and grow stronger. This wouldn't be without challenges amid global inflation and uncertainty. While it is very important for policymakers to make the right decision for their countries, it is imperative that ASEAN countries collaborate to strengthen the region's economy. In Indonesia's 2023 ASEAN chairmanship, the country will continue to lead discussions on various issues of concern. The finance track will maintain focus on three priority agendas: recovery, rebuilding, digital economy, and sustainability. The discussions and actions by ASEAN is important to make sure that the region, in all its beauty, survive and thrive for centuries to come. So let us work together and make this the year of ASEAN. ASEAN Matters, epicentrum of growth. The story of ASEAN begins with an understanding of the virtue that regional cooperation can bring. It begins with a clear vision that to overcome future challenges, countries of Southeast Asia need to stand together. Indonesia is proud to be a part of ASEAN, where each country has its own uniqueness, where cultures are versatile with a hint of similarities. In the 2023 chairmanship, Indonesia celebrates both our similarities and differences. We also invite you to discover Indonesia and all its diversity. From the glorious Sumatra, the majestic Java, the dynamic Borneo, the lively Sulawesi, the spiritual Bali, to the exotic Papua. While vastly different, we believe that the uniqueness of each culture is one of the things that make Indonesia special. This is why the diversities within ASEAN countries should be embraced. Because amid the differences, we can only be stronger through solidarity. ASEAN Matters, epicentrum of growth. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, has been at the center of regional cooperation since 1967, when 5 countries signed the ASEAN Declaration. Over the years, more countries in the region have joined the association, making it more effective and impactful. ASEAN has proven its value with various economic achievements, including in trade and connectivity. Throughout the pandemic, ASEAN further strengthened its members' cooperation, which includes the establishment of a COVID-19 response fund. But the struggle is far from over. While countries are now better equipped to manage COVID-19, we are still facing the economic impact of the pandemic with the daunting threat of high inflation and recession. In times like these, regional cooperation becomes more important than ever. ASEAN countries need to stand together to rebuild from the pandemic. With the 2023 ASEAN chairmanship, Indonesia is ready to lead the region in strengthening cooperation in various fields. In the finance track, 3 priority economic deliverables are established: recovery, rebuilding, digital economy, and sustainability. Together, ASEAN countries and invitees will hold discussions to make sure that the deliverables are achieved. Because if there's anything that the pandemic has taught us, it is the importance of working together to recover, to grow. ASEAN Matters, epicentrum of growth.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Balinese Gamelan Ensembles, Ballet Ganjur. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. A very special welcome to Your Excellencies, Governor of Bank Indonesia, His Excellency Bapak Periwarjo, Minister of Finance of Republic of Indonesia, Her Excellency Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Governor of Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, His Excellency Mr. Felipe Medaglia, Deputy Governor of Bank of Thailand, His Excellency Mr. Ronaldol Numnonda, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and welcome to the Gala Seminar Indonesia Chairmanship ASEAN 2023, Enhancing Policy Calibration for Macro-Financial Resilience, ASEAN Matters, Epicentrum of Growth, here in Bali Nusa Dua Convention Center, 29 of March 2023. My name is Dinantiar and it's my honor to welcome all of you today. Ladies and gentlemen, today's agenda has started with performance from Bali Ganjur. Bali Ganjur is an attractive, welcoming music of Balinese that depicts strength, alignment, and synergy between various elements to achieve priority economic deliverables of Indonesia ASEAN Chairmanship 2023 towards ASEAN as the epicentrum of growth. Ladies and gentlemen, the heightened global risks provide challenges to the underway economic recovery. Here, ASEAN countries, which are small open economies, are particularly affected by the impact of global turmoil, which often leads to higher risks of economic crisis. Today's Gala Seminar will discuss a systematic analytical framework and implementation guidance to navigate global economic challenges, enhancing policy mix in ASEAN region, promoting growth and structural reforms. Distinguished guests, let us give a warm welcome to our moderator today. She is a notable Indonesian journalist, Ms. Kania Sutisna Winata.
Thank you for that warm introduction. Hello and a very good afternoon, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Again, welcome to our Gala Seminar Indonesia 2023 ASEAN Chairmanship. My name is Kania Sutisna Winata, and it's an honor for me to be here to moderate this next event. Without further ado, I would like now to invite our distinguished panelists to please join me on stage. First and foremost, His Excellency Periwarjo, Governor of Bank Indonesia. Her Excellency Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Finance Minister of Indonesia. And His Excellency Felipe Medaglia, Governor Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, to please join me on stage. Please welcome. A big round of applause. It's an honor to have you with us on this glorious occasion. I hope each and every one of you is doing very well. Yes? Keeping yourself healthy and safe. That's excellent. Let me just give a brief introduction to our topic this afternoon, which is enhancing policy calibration for macro financial resilience. A lot of big words in that, but I would just like to give a short brief on what we are going to be talking about. Policy calibration, as we all know, is a lesson learned throughout this pandemic, especially in the case of Indonesia in the last couple of years at least, that we hope to gain more understanding as we navigate a world that is not less dynamic. We are seeing elevated inflation, higher interest rates, reduced investment, and global geopolitical disruptions that will challenge the ASEAN region, already dubbed the fastest growing economic regions in the world, or the epicentrum of growth. So we are facing a more challenging macroeconomic environment due to global economic conditions and tightening monetary policy that will impact ASEAN countries with the prospect of a, quote, marginal slowdown, unquote. This is according to a World Bank report. So going forward, how can ASEAN countries' financial authorities formulate policy response to mitigate negative global spillover effect while also supporting the ongoing domestic economic recovery? How will policy calibration play a role in building macro financial resilience? Let us now turn to our panelists. Let's start with a brief round of remarks or presentations of about 10 to 15 minutes each to kickstart our discussion. First to speak, I would like to invite His Excellency Peri Warjio, the Governor of Bank Indonesia, to share insights on Bank Indonesia's policy response and its impact on the Indonesian economy. The floor is yours, Excellency.
Thank you, Kania, my dear friend, Excellency Minister Sri Mulyani, as well as fellow dear friend, Governor Felipe Mendola from Bangko Sentral. Ladies and gentlemen, ASEAN is epicenter of growth, the story of growth. Yet we are facing a recurrent crisis after crisis. What three lessons that we can draw? Why ASEAN matter and continue to be the ASEAN growth, despite global turbulences, which is one, we are consistently adopting the prudent macroeconomic policy, being fiscal, monetary, central bank. Second, we continue to be innovative, reform in many areas, including also digitalization. And the third, the closeness of policy coordination among the government, central bank, and authorities. This is the three aspects why the behind skin of growth epicentrum in Asia. Let me just go through Indonesian experience. Can I have my slide, please? If we have in Indonesia, of course, our slide, how the policy mix. When we are facing a very challenging policy confronted with recurrent or multi-dimension of crisis, we cannot rely on one single policy response. The policy mix is becoming important. Can we have my slide? Okay, next slide, please. I will run through how Indonesia weathering the global financial crisis.
Sorry, Governor, there's a clicker available if you would like to
operate. I will call my step two. Okay, we are still facing, after 3 years of the COVID, we are still confronting with the turbulences in the global, which is small open economy facing the global turbulences. I continue voicing, we are facing the global slowdown of economic growth, which is in Europe, in the US. Thanks to China is recovering. But still, this is what we are seeing. Inflation is still high, even though it's declining. Probably next year will come back to longer term inflation. And we also seeing the Fed fund rate maybe will be reaching not only 5, but more probably 5.25, probably 5.5% higher for longer. And of course, dollar is still strong, 100.3, 100.5 dollar index now. And now, with what happening in the US, 3 banks, and then global financial condition, now still, global investor is still, withdrawing from investing in emerging market. So how then the story of Indonesia next? Despite this global financial crisis, both Minister Sri Mulyani and myself working very hard how to ensure economic growth of Indonesia still strong, stability intact. We, thanks this year, Bank Indonesia forecasted our economic growth will be about 5.1, 5.2%. Next year will be 5.3%, supported by domestic consumption, export, investment. Inflation, I think core inflation will be still about 3% on, but the CPI inflation will coming down to below 4%, 3.5% in the second semester after September because of the base effect of last year adjustment of the fuel price. Lending will be growing 10 to 12% this year and next year. What good of Indonesia is the fast growing digitalization, growing very rapidly, whether we're talking about digital banking, e-commerce, as well as also on the payment system industry. So Indonesia is one story of other ASEAN. We are also seeing other ASEAN also high growth, stability, and of course digitalization is matter. Next slide. This is the story behind. Let I say it. Small economy confronted with the recurrent global financial crisis. Of course, we have to adopt prudent policy. But of course, we are also to be innovative in addressing. The policy make is very important through the coordination between government, central bank, and also a related agency, Indonesia Financial Services Authority or Otoritas Jasa Keuangan. We have Indonesia national policy mix. One, policy mix of fiscal and monetary. Second, the policy mix on deepening financial market reform in the financial sector, thanks to our new law of Indonesia. The third is, of course, about digitalization of the economy and finance. The fourth is about how we need to deepen also about the real sector transformation. Indonesia downstreaming is also the story, and last but not least is green and inclusive economy. So this is the national policy mix that we adopt Indonesia to ensure the stability, resilience, continue recovery, and of course resilience. This is what we coordinated nationally under the strong leadership of President Joko Widodo, Bu Sri Mulyani as Minister of Finance, and myself as Governor Central Bank, where actually we take together hand by hand as a national policy make with regard of independency or different authority. But we work closely. This is the values of Indonesia, the value of ASEAN. How about Bank Indonesia? Next. Bank Indonesia also adopting what we call it central bank policy mix. We do not rely on this aspect only on one policy, which is monetary. And many central bank in advanced country only relying any problem relying on monetary policy and especially through the interest rate. No, we cannot do that. In Indonesia, we have what we call it central bank policy mix, consists of monetary policy, macro-prudential, as well as of the payment system. This is very important. For Indonesia, our monetary policy being geared toward how to address stability in addressing global financial crisis. And for supporting economic growth, we have accommodative macro-prudential, digital also payment system, and other policy. Let me just address the three aspects of our policy mix. First is on the next slide, on the monetary policy, innovation for macroeconomic stability. Yes, we resort through the interest rate policy response. This is our main instrument is interest rate. So last year when we facing high interest rate, then why we increase our policy rate? 225 basis point, 5.75% now our policy rate, but we say this should be sufficient to bring back the inflation. But we do not only rely on interest rate. We need to also stabilize exchange rate because Indonesia being confronted by so volatile global financial condition. We need to stabilize the exchange rate to ensure that inflation under control, our monetary financial stability continue under control. And for Indonesia, we also ensuring that export proceeds being used for deepening our financial market. So we already issuing, we refrain of using capital flows management, but we are introducing more market mechanism instrument to ensure that depositor of the exporter have a market mechanism based of high rewarded interest rate on that aspect. So our monetary policy is for stability, consistently using interest rate being complemented by exchange rate stability, other policy to deepen our FX market. Next slide. On the macro prudential, all of our macro prudential are for supporting bank lending. So ladies and gentlemen, Indonesia on the path of economic recovery. This year, our output gap is just closing to zero. When economic cycle is increasing, then financial cycle is just following. So our lending is still below potential. So that's why we continue accommodative. We are relaxing all of our macro prudential. We are of loan to value ratio 100%, as well as we are giving incentive for bank to extend lending, especially for priority sector to address the scarring effect. I think most of our corporate is still already on the exit policy of scarring, except for probably 4 or 5 subsector that still under scarring. But we are continue giving incentive for bank to extend lending. Once again, Indonesia is still on the path of economic recovery. Our output gap is just will be closing zero end of this year. Our financial cycle is still below optimal, probably just closing next year. On that aspect, monetary stability, monetary policy is for stability, macro prudential is for bank to extend loan. Last slide, next. This is digitalization. I think Indonesia is one of the fast growing digitalization in the world. As I already mentioned, the progress of the digital banking, e-commerce, payment system, we adopt the three-pronged approach. One language, one nation, as well as also one island. One language. In Indonesia, all of payment system language must use national standard. This is requirement. We have QR standard, national standard. There is no standard in Indonesia, QR, only QR Indonesia. We do not allow any other standard to be adopted. This is one language, QR. Fast payment, this is also using standard national. We are also a national standard of open banking. Services in the payment system using coding, we are working with industry using what we call SNAP, the national standard, national open API banking. This is standard for language on the payment services. We develop with industry, all of them, language for transfer and so on. And we also interconnectivity, interoperability, and interoperability of our infrastructure. All of our infrastructure payment system already and in the process of interconnectivity. We have a fast payment. Our fast payment soon will be interconnected with national payment gateway. Next, we will be interconnected with electronic trading platform in the money market. Central counterparty in the money market, and next will also integrate it with real-time gross settlement. So we are building like the toll road with the interconnection for one toll to connect digital connectivity of Indonesia, because Indonesia is widespread. So this is the second principle. The third principle is one nation. We are consolidate our payment system industry. Regulatory reform. So yesterday when we talking about the banking digitalized, the banking working closely with payment company, they are cross ownership or cross business engagement, and also ecosystem with marketplace, e-commerce. So we are building ecosystem of digital banking, payment system industry, and the e-commerce. We are ecosystem of digital economy and finance. And this is last but not least, ASEAN toward cross-border connectivity under regional payment connectivity. Last year, we already signed the 5 central bank, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines. And next year, all of ASEAN will also joining the ASEAN regional connectivity. This is digitalized of ASEAN going to the world. So this is the story of the epicentrum. Of course, we need to be prudent, but of course, we are adopting policy mix and we are working together, synergize. Back to you. Okay.
Very well. Thank you very much for that brief presentation from the Governor of Bank Indonesia, His Excellency Peri Warjio. And next to speak, I would like to invite His Excellency Felipe M. Medalla, Governor Bangko Sentral ng Pilipina, to share his insights from the Philippines' perspectives, its experiences in building economic recovery, and what it hopes to gain perhaps from a stronger ASEAN. The floor is yours, Excellency.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank our hosts, especially Governor Perry and Minister Sri Mulyani. You have a wonderful place here, and of course, Bali is a very easy city to love. Love the beaches, love the culture, love the dances, the gongs, so on. I will avoid using jargon, which is the title. What I'll do instead is talk about the Philippines, and I have only two charts. But essentially, for those of you who are students of economics, I will start with the so-called Tinbergen principle, which is if you have, let's say, 5 objectives, you must have at least 5 tools. The other way to put it, it's very hard to shoot 2 birds with 1 stone unless the birds are so dumb they align themselves before you throw the stone. The other reason you need a lot of tools is sometimes the medicine that's good for an illness could have side effects. So therefore, you try to find another medicine that will not have the side effects. And sometimes you may actually settle for the weaker medicine which has a weaker side effect. Okay, so in many sense, we economists are people who wanted to be doctors of medicine but ended up being doctors of economics. Okay, so now the other thing that I say is that in an inflation targeting central bank, in general, the exchange rate is not important until it is important. So that's a bit of a contradiction, but what it means is study after study shows that when the exchange rate is moving up and down, little changes, when you look at its effect on inflation, it's nearly 0. And it's to the credibility of banks like Bank of Indonesia, Bank of Thailand, Federal Bank of the Philippines, that's the case. I remember when exchange rate changes had such large effects on inflation. And as we adopted inflation targeting, that became less and less so. Also, we never listened to the IMF that reserves are not important. Because we know that money from abroad can be very fickle. And much of those money are with you when you don't need it. So you better have money when those times come. Okay, so now to talk about these choices. As you can see, there are really 3 indicators there. You can ignore the last one. The first one is the change in the policy rate. And sad to say, or good to say, the Philippines is the top notcher there. No? We increased our policy rate from 2% or 200 basis points to 6.25 or 625 basis points. The next country, South Korea, is much, much lower. So on the other hand, the Philippines, like Indonesia, had appreciating currency since January. But we had a tremendous drop in the currency January last year to August last year, when the U.S. started their jumbo increase in policy rate. To keep it simple, the explanation is if a peso instrument that is compared to a US dollar instrument, other things equal, you'd prefer the dollar instrument if the interest rates are the same. Meaning, like it or not, the dollar is safe haven. And in the case of the Philippines, the markets tend to doubt the peso when the difference between the policy rate of the BSP, the Bangko Sentral, is less than 1 to 1.25% higher than the Fed. So when the Fed started raising its rates, the peso started to fall, and in just 8 months, the peso fell by 13% from January last year to August. Of course, we were forced to respond. To make matters worse, we had all sorts of shortages. Of course, the Ukraine war also caused some shortages of fertilizer. But later on, we were quite unlucky. I called the inflation that we had shortage of many little things. Okay, sugar, 100% increase in price. Onions. By the way, the onions, as you can see, the small ones look like earrings. So they're so expensive, no? So you can use them as earrings. Not chili. And then the pigs got Asian swine flu, shortage of meat. Okay, and then of course, if pork becomes expensive, chicken will be expensive too. People will be shifting. So all those things, relatively small part of the budget, but increasing by lots. So this was a terrible, terrible supply shock. And in the last 13 months, ending last January, every month prices increasing by at least 0.4%. Of course, 0.4 times 12 is 5%, almost 5%, whereas our inflation target is just 4. Okay, so in this sense, we are really forced to act very, very. Well, we had 2 meetings where we had 75 basis points. 2 meetings we had 50. 1 meeting we had 25. By the way, I became governor because the Secretary of Finance. The governor became Secretary of Finance. It's like the two of you traded places. And I increased policy rates more than, just in the central bank for 6 months, I increased policy rates more than the 2 previous governors. So, which really re-anchored expectations, stabilized the peso, and by January to December last year, from 12.9% depreciation, it became just 8.9%. And just like Indonesia, January this year to current date, we appreciated by about 2.7, 2.8%. We're literally twins there, right? 2 points. The only difference is we did more policy rate increases. Now, a question I'm always asked is, hey, the U.S. increased policy rate and caused the failure of Silicon Valley Bank. Because then, as interest rates increase, the value of securities fall. And my classic answer is, well, this time in the Philippines, the banks are strong. Indeed, they're so strong, when we were hit by COVID, because we have one of the longest and stringent quarantines. Our economy contracted 17% in the second quarter, 9.5% for the full year last year, in 2020. Okay. By the way, since we are expecting the economy to grow by 6%, it's really a 16% contraction. And yet, because the banks were well capitalized, because we adopted Basel standards very very, very quickly. And because the banks are also, well, the people running the banks, they were probably the vice presidents or the managing directors in 1997. So they all knew the memory of the Asian financial crisis. And to make things even better, we had a boom in BPO. Plus the remittances, we had recurring current account surpluses. And with the inflows coming from the, as a result of very expansive monetary policies in the US, our reserves increased from $45 billion to 90. And the central bank bought a lot of dollars. Of course, we will end up creating a lot of money, increasing money supply, so we increased the reserve requirements to 20, which is, of course, terrible in the long run, but good in the short run. Now, when we decided to cut the reserve requirements, because it's not a good idea to overtax the sector that you're regulating, when we did that, we also introduced new regulations, which we call the liquidity regulations. So the banks were also quite liquid because of our regulations, and also because of the timing of the increase, the reduction in the reserve requirements. So the banks were well capitalized and quite liquid. So therefore, we are confident that 425, probably even more, can be done without risking financial stability. In short, we have the policy rate for inflation, and we have the banking regulations for stability. And we were able to achieve it. And because we did not believe the IMF, we always had plenty of reserves. Okay, so we enjoyed it when we were there in. We were together, all of us, in that meeting with the IMF, and we collectively told them they don't know what they're doing, right? Now, okay, so that's the situation. We are, okay, let me now go to my last chart. So inflation remains a top concern, and in fact, from the point of view of policy rates, the only concern. And we are quite confident that that medicine will not have negative side effects on financial stability because the banks are strong. That's the second bullet. And liquid. So therefore, we have the luxury of aiming for inclusiveness and digitalization. So, and all things, by the way, our last two prints of inflation was January 8.7, February 8.6, but it looks much better month on month. January to February is 0. Meaning January this year is much higher than January last year. And February this year is much higher than February last year. But January to February, it seems to be stabilizing already. If this continues, and we are quite confident it will, because one of the main reasons for the shortages is we protect farmers too much from imports. And the president has decided to let those imports in. So more onions from Indonesia, I suppose. Okay, so in other words, we are resilient. Now, that's not the same as saying we never lose sleep at night. Because anything can hit you. And we, for example, have these regular exercises. Imagine if conglomerate X fails. Okay, let's say X is a big bank, X has a big real estate, etc., etc. If I keep adding numbers, you can guess the name, so I will not do that anymore. And then another one, X is in beer, okay, and so on and so forth. We do this, and our own conclusion is the system is strong, and also these conglomerates are quite well managed, and the banks are quite well managed. So, of course, you can have You can have a big geopolitical event that comes from nowhere. Okay, let's say Taiwan is so close to us. If that becomes a flashpoint, yeah. Well, maybe I shouldn't tell this joke, but when I was a graduate student, I come from a place where there are tornadoes. There's a sign there, what to do in the case of an earthquake. A tornado, cyclone. Said, find the strongest table, go underneath it, put your head between your legs, and kiss your ass goodbye. So, so that's because it's extreme complacency to believe that you're so okay that nothing can happen. Because the very nature of banking is risky. You're lending money that can leave any time for 10-year loans. Okay, this is a nice business. Maturity mismatch is a nice business because the 10-year interest rate is much higher than the overnight rate. But when people change their mind, you can have self-fulfilling prophecies. If people think you will fail, you will, because they will withdraw their money. And no bank is liquid enough to service all of the deposits if there's panic. So the entire idea is, of course, to be transparent, communicate. And of course, hope for the best that the global environment will be a lot more conducive to stable growth. Okay, I guess I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Very well. Thank you very much for that, Governor Felipe. Let's go on to our next presentation. And last but not least, let's hear from the Finance Minister of Indonesia, Her Excellency Sri Mulyani Indrawati, to share insights on. We've heard a lot about the monetary side of things. We want to hear also the fiscal side, fiscal response, fiscal calibration that we've been talking about to support economic recovery in Indonesia, and perhaps you can touch on policy coordination as well among financial authorities. The floor is yours, Excellency.
Thank you, Kania, Pak Felipe, and all distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for inviting me for this important seminar. First, when we talk about the policy calibration, the policy need to be calibrated or recalibrated because the economy continuously changing. So first, before the pandemic hit the global economy or the world, in Indonesia, we know that when the sun shines, fix your roof. So don't fix your roof when there is a thunderstorm. Then you are going to get the lightning in this case. So in Indonesia, we translate that with policy on both fiscal and monetary side. Pak Perry has already mentioned quite elaborate on the monetary side. On the fiscal side, meaning that we consolidate our fiscal before the downturn because of the pandemic. Right before the pandemic, our fiscal position on the primary balance is almost balanced. The deficit is continuously declined, and we try to manage, while on the one hand, a lot of structural issues that still need to be addressed. For example, infrastructure need is still very high. Human capital investment is also very important. Building the social safety net, health system, they are all cost significant of money. But at the same time, we also reforming so that we are also receiving with revenue that can finance that. So we can decline our deficit. With that situation in a position of relatively strong, then pandemic hit us. And we are all knows very well the pandemic is an extraordinary challenge. And Indonesia responded with extraordinary policy response. First, because of the paralyzing economic activity due to the pandemic, the revenue dropped almost 19%. And at the same time, the spending increased significantly. So Indonesia cannot maintain our fiscal prudential rule, which is already adopted and implemented for 15 years. That is, we cannot exceed the deficit more than 3% of GDP by single fiscal year. Because of the pandemic, we know that this will be break the prudential rule on the fiscal side. So we have the emergency law to be able to relax this policy cap, allowing deficit on the fiscal to be exceeding 3% of GDP. But we also understand that if you start to allow the deficit to be unlimited, it can create a dangerous situation. In many countries, fiscal discipline is going to be then gone, and that's going to create another problem. And that's why the calibration of the policy is that we need the relaxation of this fiscal prudential rule, but we know that this pandemic is not going to be forever. So we provide only 3 years for us to be able to then return to the fiscal prudent policy rule again. And that's why the emergency law that is passed during the pandemic will only allow fiscal tools to have deficit above 3% of GDP only for 3 years. We work together with Bank Indonesia, OJK, Financial Sector Authority, and Deposit Insurance, making sure that this pandemic will not then creating financial instability. Because when the economy collapses, then we know that it will be translated into non-performing loans, then can also create a problematic on a financial system. So at that time, we adopted relaxation on the monetary side as well as on the financial sector regulation. There is regulatory forbearance. With those situations, we allow the pandemic to be then handled because we were allowed to make loan or debt higher. We borrow more, but then during the first initial time of this pandemic, the market was actually behaving irrationally. They are all panicked globally. So the price of the bonds is actually dropped, the yield increase. Because they cannot assess what is going to be the risk. And that's why during this very important situation, in addition to for us, first relaxing the fiscal prudential rule and then regulatory forbearance for the financial sector, especially banking, we also make an exceptional rule with Bank Indonesia. That is what we call it burden sharing. The deficit can be financed not only through the market and Bank Indonesia to become a standby buyer, but Bank Indonesia as a central bank allowed to finance our deficit directly, but only during this pandemic situation. During that time, we really need to communicate with so many stakeholders, rating agency, bondholder, market, in order for them to be convinced that this is only temporary arrangement that is not going to be jeopardizing the independence of central bank and the prudential policy of the fiscal in the medium term. So that's what we call it policy calibration during the extraordinary time. We were able to adopt an extraordinary policy by breaking our prudential rule, but without creating credibility issue. This is because, as mentioned by Pak Perry earlier, there is a track record on the macro side, both on the fiscal and monetary side, that we are prudent. And we continue communicating that. Now fast forward, after the pandemic happened to be for the fiscal side, after very hard contraction in 2020, but we are not as deep as in Philippines, the contraction of our economy is at the deepest, it's 5%, 5.3%, and then we start to recover very soon, immediately after that contraction. 2021, we were able to recover, although not as strong as what we expected because of the Delta variant at that time. But on the fiscal side, we enjoyed the recovery much faster. Revenue increased by 30%, both because of the commodity as well as the recovery of the economy. While at the same time, we try to continue maintaining the discipline on the spending side. With that, the deficit of the fiscal side can be reduced significantly into 4%, 4.5% on the second year after the pandemic. This is initially, we actually designed the deficit is going to be at 5.7% of GDP. So it's much lower deficit. 2022, the recovery is even stronger. Our economy growing by 5.3%. Commodity globally increased in an extreme level. On the one hand, Indonesia enjoyed this commodity price from the coal, CPO, or even other mineral commodities. So we continue enjoy revenue which is very strong, growing at around 30% again. But the spending continue to be maintained at the level of nominally it's the same, but in terms of the real growth, it's very, very low growth. It's only less than 5%. The result, the deficit on our fiscal side in 2022 is only 2.3%. So consolidation in such a very short and strong one. And with that, our burden sharing with Bank Indonesia has been implemented only for 3 years. When we are in the 2022, we know that the world is changing the tide. It is no longer pandemic as the biggest risk. Inflation became the biggest risk globally. And with that, the response from the central bank, especially the Fed and European Central Bank, with such a very steep increase, will definitely creating additional or changing risks for both macro policy and the economy in general. So we have to recalibrate again our policy mix with Bank Indonesia. First, because of our consolidation on the fiscal side, we actually can tap the financing relatively in a cheap position. During the pandemic, I was able to get the deficit financing for central bank, but that's only during the pandemic. But we utilize all the room which is provided by Paperi to us. We use all the room which is provided on the financing. Central bank said that I can allow you to have this financing deficit directly from the central bank, but only this much, only related to health and humanitarian concern. We use all those space. Although actually we don't need those financing because our deficit is actually very low. We use it to actually build the buffer of cash in 2022 because we know in 2023 we are going to be hit hard by the increasing interest rate due to the inflation and a pricey bonds issuance. With that now entering the third month of 2023, we are still in the plenty of cash buffer, but we know that this is actually to buffer us from this very volatile global situation. So the policy mix continue to be recalibrated because each year the challenge is coming from different source of risk, but the fundamental of the economy should be maintained and need to be making sure that they are strong and sound. So within that context, Ministry of Finance responsible for the balance sheet of the government. And if the fiscal policy is sound and credible, it will make the work of central bank also easier, because they have to not only stabilizing the inflation, exchange rate, Pak Peri also maintaining the stability of our bond price. It seems like generous, but actually serving Pak Peri's own interest also in this case. That the bonds is in the balance sheet of central bank also. And now the bonds is also in the balance sheet of the banking sector. Now we do understand that the situation in the United States with the SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, in which the bank holding government bond, in which the bond suffering from a very steep interest rate by Federal Reserve, suffering in terms of the price. So mark to market will definitely erode their balance sheet. Bank Indonesia, Ministry of Finance, Financial Sector Authority, and Deposit Insurance, we watch with a high vigilance of this episode in the United States and European. We discussed, and of course we did, and we continue doing stress tests. As mentioned by Governor Felipe, that this is a must for us to not being surprised with any potential risk that may come from this very different risk or dynamic. And that's why the policy calibration first, that when we have time to consolidate, we have to consolidate. Doing it in a very persistent, credible way and transparent way. So that we were able to create buffer, because we really don't know whether the next 6 months or 12 months, the situation is not going to be favorable, and you need all your power, all your consolidated power to face with this kind of uncertainty. Fiscal policy playing a very important role as the shock absorber, counter-cyclical policy. The problem with any economy is going to be in a very difficult situation when your policy becoming pro-cyclical. When it's the cycle down, you even make it worse. When the cycle up, you even make overheating. So these are the challenges as a macro policy mix between monetary and fiscal policy, but that can only be done when the stability of financial sector secure. So the balance sheet of the financial sector, whether bank and non-bank financial institution, need to be continue monitored. And this is exactly how the coordination between all this authority is a must. Pak Peri mentioned earlier that our relationship institutionally and personally is very good, and that helped a lot. Because in time of crisis, market and economy need anchor of confidence. If there is a crack of coordination, it will worsen this kind of crisis. We learn a lot, of course. Pak Peri is veteran. He was in the IMF also as an ED. I'm in the IMF ED. I was in the World Bank. So we know that in time of crisis, we need to be together. There is no us and you and us, but you and me, but it is actually us. We know that the balance sheet need to carry the burden, and that's why we are very open and transparent. How much we can afford to carry the burden, how much is actually good for the economy, even at the cost of each of us have to carry a certain burden. I think that is going to be one of the most important lesson learned from this, even in the past 4 years, with an extraordinary and providing us with a very, very important lesson learned. I also would like to close by saying that even during this very critical time, and we are very occupied with monetary and fiscal policy in creating the right mix to stabilize, to counter-cyclical, and to recover the economy, we are not just tinkering the macroeconomic tools. We are also doing a lot of reform as mentioned by Pak Peri. Because you cannot just doing the macro policy, this is like a bandage for a problem which is structural. And that's why the leadership of President Jokowi and working together with the cabinet is very important, because structural reform need to be implemented by the whole cabinet, even at the local level. So we did that. We passed the legislation like job creation law, the harmonizing fiscal or tax policy, local government fiscal relation. We also just passed the financial sector reform. These are all big and very important legislation in order for us to be able not only addressing the temporary short-term issue, but for us to be able to build the medium and long-term structural issue. So with that, I think that is one of a very, very important lesson. You have to build the credibility. When you have time, you will need it, those credibility during a very critical time, and you have to replenish those credibility when you have time again. So these are all the most important lessons learned for all of us. Thank you so much.
Very well. Thank you very much for that, Minister. Wow, a lot of lesson learned that we have just heard from each of our panelists, distinguished panelists. We have the Indonesian experience from the monetary and the fiscal side, and we have the Philippines experience mostly from the monetary side. What I'm wondering, as was mentioned earlier by the minister, she was saying that in times of crisis, we need to stick together. That's one of the lessons learned as well. So when we talk about policy calibration, it has worked for Indonesia. So when we take it into the context of ASEAN, perhaps, as we weather global uncertainties and we want to actually benefit from a stronger ASEAN in terms of economic growth as a region. So what I wanted to ask, and this is a question for all of you, is where do you see ASEAN in the global economy right now, and where do we plan to take it next, and how do you propose we go about it? I'd like to start with Governor Perry first.
Well, the theme of Indonesian presidency, as Minister Sri Mulyani mentioned, ASEAN matter epicenter of growth. Collectively, ASEAN 5 will be 4.6 this year and will be 5.6 growth next year, and continue advancing. Counting also the other ASEAN also, increasing the growth going forward. What we mean by moving forward ASEAN to be on the epicenter of growth? Of course, one, the correct policy mix of the ASEAN. Of course, Minister Sri Mulyani and myself working closely this year, one agenda under ASEAN chairmanship of Indonesia is how ASEAN can strengthen the national policy mix between government fiscal policy, central bank policy, as well as structural reform. This is an agenda that we will be moving forward. Second, regularly among the central bank governors as well as Minister of Finance, we have a regular meeting. I have a meeting with my governor, Felipe, is almost at least every 2 months, BIS, as well as the other governor. And I can call every day, anytime. So just to making sure the governors of ASEAN is very close, because we share each other, context each other, including also how to weather the current situation. This is one. Second, one, of course, continuing to support the growth. Second, as well as correct policy make, fiscal, monetary, structural reform. In the central bank, we meet very, very frequently. Not only the central bank, all the deputies. I know the youngster of the central bank of the ASEAN. Even the LO, the young economists, I know them, they know us because we have very close community. This is number 3. This is the agenda that we are bringing going forward from ASEAN to the global. So since last year under G20 presidency and now also Indonesia chairmanship of ASEAN, we want to bring the experience of ASEAN to the global. So in this juncture, IMF, of course, developing what they call it integrated policy framework. The IMF integrated policy framework is just what ASEAN practicing. Fiscal and monetary policy mix. And the central bank also, as Governor Felice mentioned, yes, we resort on interest rate, but being complemented by exchange rate stability, adequate foreign exchange. This is what actually the IMF doing, the integrated policy framework. The BIS working what they call it monetary macro financial stability framework. This is actually what we practice among the central bank, the mix of monetary and macro prudential in ASEAN. So number 3, actually, we want to bring the experience of ASEAN, of national policy make, central bank policy to the world, and now working closely with the IMF integrated policy framework and BIS macro financial stability framework. There's 3 aspects we want to move going forward.
Governor Felipe, do you have anything to add to that? It's the same question basically, but maybe I'll throw this other question for you as well, is what do you see as something in common between the Philippines and Indonesia in terms of, macro and also policies, in terms of policy making, formulating policy?
Well, I'll start culturally and linguistically. Like a lot of our words are the same. Ulo. Then puti, white.
Yeah.
Yes. And in some parts of the Philippines, rice is nasi.
Okay.
Depending on which part of the Philippines. So we have a lot in common, and these are friendships that are. My former dean, who died, and after whom the building is named, he says, Philip, the Indonesians are our cousins. And in that sense, having many things in common, it's so easy to work together. And of course, the fact that how we've gone such a long way in our economy is becoming more integrated. How many goods have tariffs now? None, right? Of course, there are products that have to be protected politically for some agriculture. So onions, okay? No. But the other thing is, I think ASEAN also has ways of pooling resources together. Although we have not extended the swaps. So there are many things we can do together, but the biggest one is we can share experiences and compare notes. So of course, getting a payment system that you can use your phone regardless of where you are in ASEAN, there should be more and more tourism between the countries as well. And that's very good because instead of us spending our money in another country, we spend it with each other. And it also develops even longer people-to-people relationships. So I think ASEAN is, and especially the ASEAN 5, which has an even longer history. And as a group, of course, the bigger and richer countries will find it harder to ignore us if we're together.
Very well. Minister, perhaps the same questions, but I'd like to throw in this question as well. But do you see any remaining vulnerabilities right now in the financial sector that you are very much concerned about, that we need to tackle it, and how can we do it as a region? How do you propose we do it?
Well, ASEAN, we have still fresh memory, 97, 98, the ASEAN financial crisis. So learning from that crisis, all ASEAN member country actually strengthening many of the regulation, especially related to the prudential banking regulation, but also on the capital market, the conduct non-bank financial institution. We also strengthening the institutional framework, the central bank becoming independent, and then they have the credible inflation target, and they also achieve those within the context of the ASEAN. I think the region of the ASEAN, that's why we call it the epicentrum of growth. This is maybe the only region in the world that can show a high growth for so long with stability. That is really the reputation of the ASEAN, and that helped us a lot in building this reputation. Then it attracting more foreign direct investors. Being neighbor in an all good managed country also provide us with a good incentive to continue being prudent. Because if it is you are reckless, you become an outlier in this region. It's so different because Pak Peri, we are all working in the multilateral institution like the IMF and so on. You can easily see that when you live in a region which is so unstable, it's so difficult for you to become prudent. And that's why in ASEAN, when you see that many countries becoming very prudent, and at the same time working hard to address the issue of structural, it makes us to be in a much favorable position to also working hard. Because we actually working, but we also competing, meaning that competing, looking at each other, oh, Philippines is now better, why we cannot be better than Philippines? Then we want to be better than Philippines. Philippines will look at other, why Thailand is much better than us. So you are going to like catching up with the best. It's not spiraling down, but we want to catching up the best. And the good side about the ASEAN is because we have one outlier like Singapore, which is totally very different and very high, but then create a very strong hard discipline and benchmark to all of us regarding what kind of policy that need to be adopted. So this become the advantage. Knowing that it doesn't mean that we are complacent and not really watching the risk. Because at the end of the day, the economy is so big, the 500 million people in the ASEAN, and this is among the region which is attracting a lot of capital, both short-term and long-term. And that's why that can create also some maybe conduct at the micro level, like corporation or banking or financial institution, which may be outlier, and that can trigger the situation or crisis. The most important, whether you can actually detect those risks early enough and then addressing the risks effective enough. The last one is, of course, as an ASEAN, also working since 1997-98, we have Chiang Mai Initiative, the ASEAN Plus 3. These are all regional financial safety net. And that's also create a certain discipline. Because when you have this financial safety net mechanism, you want to make sure that this safety net will not be used. That means that you have to really prevent. I think the evolution of the financial safety net, in this case like Chiang Mai Initiative ASEAN Plus 3, provide us with a lot of lessons learned. First, we said that, oh, we want to be different from the IMF. And then we said that, well, you cannot be different. So you have like the link and de-link portion. And that's also creating quite a lot of discussion regarding what kind of policy framework that satisfy with this kind of condition. So it's a very good in the sense that the region is always talking in the language which is rational, pragmatic, but tend to be in a good benchmarking. And that's make us also good. On the one hand also, the independency of this authority, they can continue to be preserved, but the independency doesn't make us or prevent us to work together. So that is really a very fine line, because you can be independent, but then your relationship becoming very bad. And then you want to jeopardize this independency. But in ASEAN, we actually can combine between, on the one hand, respecting the integrity and independency of each authority, and the degree of technocracy is quite remarkable in the ASEAN. And at the same time, while we are independent, we can work together in an effective way, just like we can shown in the COVID and this crisis time. Thank you.
Very well. I'd like to go to the floor right now to perhaps solicit some perspective. I know we have Mr. Rupert Thorne, Deputy Secretary General of the FSB. Perhaps you would like to share your views and perspective on the topic, or maybe a couple of questions to the panelists as well.
Thanks very much. Yes, thanks very much to the speakers for their very insightful presentations, raising a wide variety of issues and the balance that's needed in the region. I'd just like to make a few remarks from a global systemic perspective and then end with a question to the panel. So the global financial stability outlook at the moment is certainly very challenging. It was already challenging before the recent events in the US and European banking systems. We had inflation persisting above target in many jurisdictions, economic growth slowing. And then we had recent events in the banking sector which have tightened global financial conditions further, led to volatility, particularly in banking asset markets. But despite this, at least for those of us from the outside, emerging market and developing economies seem to have been very resilient thus far. But we know that this is the kind of backdrop that we've always been concerned can create particular challenges for countries that are dependent on external finance. And we always knew, even before the recent events, that rising interest rates in an environment of, around the world, very high levels of public and private sector debt were likely to lead to challenges for financial stability. We didn't know quite what the triggers would be for this, but we knew something would trigger actions. And so it's going to be important for everyone to remain vigilant, and goodness knows, from the advanced economies, we've had a lesson about complacency from the latest events. So nevertheless, we've seen authorities take decisive action. We've seen US and Swiss authorities take very swift action to maintain global financial stability. We've seen coordinated actions by central banks to make swap lines more available. And recent events have also highlighted the importance of the G20 financial reforms from the 2008 crisis that have strengthened resilience, notwithstanding the cases we've seen. They've strengthened overall resilience. They've increased capital and liquidity buffers in the banking system hugely. And they've strengthened cross-border regulatory and supervisory cooperation, which the Minister has emphasized the importance of. So they've also underlined the importance not just of the measures that were taken, but the great importance of national authorities actually completing the implementation of the international standards that were agreed in a full, timely and consistent manner, which I think the countries in this region have taken a lead in, and of maintaining an open and resilient global financial system that's grounded in international standards, and that's crucial to support the growth that we all need. So national authorities and standard setters around the world are going to be reviewing the lessons learned from the latest incident. As far as we in the Financial Stability Board are concerned, we'll be reviewing in particular the lessons learned by authorities resolving financial institutions recently, what the lessons are for the international resolution framework, because we set the international standard in that area. The reform agenda, just to repeat, the reform agenda of 2008 has gone a long way in bolstering the resilience of the global financial system, but we've had a very helpful reminder that there's further work to be done. So much for the global outlook. My question to the panel would be, against this background, I'd be interested in how the financial system in this region has been affected by the most recent events that we've had around the world. what shock waves have you felt, and how's the system coped?
Very well. Governor?
Yes, one. This region financial system mostly and all of them are resilient. We have a very long experience since 97, 98 ASEAN crisis, where this region going through reform and restructuring of the financial system. So most of the bank in the region, especially in Indonesia, also very high capitalized. Indonesia, for example, capital adequacy ratio, more than 25%. It's very, very high. That's one. High capital. Second, we have already also implement the international standard. Number three, most of this ASEAN, including also Indonesia, have what we call it financial system stability committee in some sort of different mechanism. In Indonesia, we call it financial system stability, but in other countries, they have a coordination where ensuring financial system stability. And of course, this is the mechanics that we already have. Number two, this does not mean that we in the region, especially also in Indonesia, we're not watching what's happening, as you mentioned, in the US and the global. In fact, Minister Sri Mulyani in Indonesia is the chairman of Financial System Stability. Myself, as a member, we have Pak Mahindra is also the member, a chairman of Financial Service Authority, and Pak Purbaya is a chairman of IDIC, Lembaga Penjamin. We talk very frequently. Of course, we have WhatsApp group now. Comparing, discussing. What we are assessing now. We learn from this model. One, whether our banking have direct exposure of US government bond. Mostly not. But we also, second, we are also assessing, stress testing the deposit model. Because those three banks very highly concentrated their deposit taking 95% only to a few large depositors. Most of Indonesian bank and this region mostly have very diverse depositor. Third, about valuation of the government bond. This is also we are doing the stress testing. This is the issue where actually we have a stress testing, and of course the stress testing on risk valuation of the government bond is already happening last year. Last year we already require bank to also increase their what we call it allowance for risk valuation. So since last year, most of the bank already build up their reserve to withstand against valuation of government bond, domestic rupiah bond, not US government bond. So I think that's on those aspects, I think most of the banking, especially Indonesia, are resilient. High capital, very device deposit taking, and for risk valuation of government bond holding, rupiah bond is already well reserved the bank. Number three, what we are discussing under financial stability, of course, to withstand the risk perception. Because from this three bank now becoming US financial system problem, and then to Switzerland, to Germany, this global aspect of risk perception, this is where we are monitoring to ensure that risk perception is very, so that's why we are communicating to the market, looking at the capital market, looking at the CDS and so on. So far, I think should be, Indonesia should be resilient on withstanding those aspects. We are watching closely, and of course, take necessary action. But so far, our banking and financial system in the region and especially Indonesia are resilient.
Okay, but still closely monitoring, yeah? Governor, how about you, Governor Felipe?
Well, actually, the scary part actually is the global financial system itself, right? You have a very large country, the U.S., largely driven by domestic politics, very, very parochial concerns, but is the center of the international financial system. And on the other hand, we, the poorer countries, must hold reserves. And the reserves we hold, I don't know about Indonesia. The biggest part of it is U.S. government securities. So the question we often ask ourselves is, with the U.S. Deficit so large, won't they eventually inflate their way out of the debt? I'm old enough to remember how they financed the Vietnam War. The inflation was high because the war was unpopular. And eventually, of course, that triggered the OPEC to say, hey, the dollars we're getting is getting smaller and smaller. We better form a cartel. So I think one big worry is the way the global financial architecture is itself not a good one. And that's why I think all of us are saying, well, there will come a time that we will really have to rely on our reserves.
Okay.
Now, of course, that is not cheap. Like we borrow, let's say at almost 6%, and that's already a good spread. And then the central bank, on the other hand, is buying U.S. government securities that pay much less. But if you don't have large reserves, then you are at the mercy of very fickle global money. So the point is, accept that the world is unfair and do your best to protect yourself. So, of course, the problem is, fortunately this is not happening in this part of the world, you'll have populism that pressures government to spend a lot more. That's why I admire Indonesia. It has these fiscal rules. They tie your hands, right? So you're, yeah. So I guess that's what countries have to do, find ways of preventing momentary weaknesses and populism from taking your eye off the long run. Now, for instance, central bank independence. The reason it exists is the national government is smart enough to realize that if we are not independent, their long-term bonds will fetch higher interest rates because they do not believe the inflation targets. So actually, if the finance minister is thinking long run, she will value a central bank independence. The problem is people, if there's short-termism and there's you're driven to do popular things and you don't want to collect taxes for it. And in every country, there's a favorite subsidy somewhere that's too costly. Okay, so that's why we say the more important thing is have no fiscal dominance. That is, you have a well-run fiscal authority, and the central bank is not under pressure to finance it. Because if a bank is too big to fail, you can imagine the national government missing payments is the central bank will not allow that, right? We will clearly come in and help, right? Because the national government failing to pay is a disaster. So therefore, if there's a big fiscal weakness, then the central bank itself gets weaker because it cannot let the government pay, and it may end up printing too much money to support the government. And the moment they start doing that, nobody believes the inflation target anymore. And what I like about our countries is it's messy, right? It's messy. The politics is messy. You wish that people were different, but you wish the politicians were better, but despite all their limitations, these countries are progressing. So I think we have to celebrate that all our countries are, despite all the problems, doing well. I think, was it Churchill who said that democracy is imperfect bad for a government except for the others, right? So it's
Very well, Governor.
So my point is that when you look at all these countries, they got problems, and they have long memories, and they have learned from the past, and they do not have this attitude that money grows on trees. So that alone, I think. And then there is also rising accountability because the middle class is growing. That, I think, itself will eventually make this region even better.
Okay. Very well. Thank you so much for that, Governor. I think we are looking at a very, very different environment right now. But I hope we are learning along the way, of course. And in conclusion, amidst these so many challenges ahead, we hope that the spirit of ASEAN at least will unify ASEAN countries to build on its strength as a region by taking collective steps as well actions towards a more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient future. So again, thank you very much, Excellencies, for your insightful discussion and also perspective on this matter. A big round of applause. And with that, I hand back to the MC.
Thank you, Ms. Kania Sutisnawinata, and all of the speakers kindly remain stay on the stage as we will have a group photo session. Allow me to count backwards. In 3, 2, 1. Okay, one more time. In 3, 2, 1. Thank you, and you may return to your seat. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big applause for the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, now we have finally reached the end of our seminar. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us today, and hopefully it was an insightful and informative seminar for all of you. Allow me, Dinantiar, on behalf of Indonesia 2023 ASEAN Chairmanship to sign off and see you on another ASEAN event. Stay safe everyone and enjoy the rest of your day. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Santi 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 Om.